Just give us kind of your perspective. What is inflation today, and what are you paying attention to when people start talking about that specific metric?
The main reason why I think anybody probably knows who I am in the first place is because during the financial crisis, I was hyper focused on a lot of this stuff because I manage money for other people. And I was trying to I really didn't care about like the political narratives around this or how to solve the problem so much as I really wanted to understand what's going on at sort of an operational level so that I can then try to navigate this knowing kind of this baseline foundation of how does the system work and how does this stuff really work at like an operational level. So like the analogy that I use a lot of the times is like understanding how a car works. When you understand how just like an internal combustion engine works and like the pedals and the gear shifters work, you can then begin to build sort of a framework for what are the parameters within which that automobile can actually operate. Like, can it go 300 miles an hour? Because you hear a lot of these sort of crazy narratives about this stuff where it's like, well, wait a minute, like that's not actually how this works. The car can't actually go 300 miles an hour. It's literally functionally not capable of doing that in this sort of an environment. And so, the thing that makes finance and economics so sort of cool and interesting is that you have a driver in that car. So it's not just the automobile. It's like sometimes you've got crazy people inside driving the car. And it's like, okay, well, this thing's only capable of doing certain things, but also it could do irrational things because you've got, stupid people or just people that are overreactive and hyper emotional steering that vehicle. So I went back like during the financial crisis and when everything was starting to really get crazy, and I'm researching how the monetary system works at like a very operational level. And it's crazy to think like back, 13, 14 years ago online, there just was not a lot of information about how the system works at like a very sort of baseline operational level. Like people weren't explaining what is quantitative easing? How does it work? How does fiscal policy work? How does government spending interact with quantitative easing? And so I was sort of kicking the tires on all this stuff and building a framework for trying to understand it. And so from a very sort of baseline understanding, I think it's crucial to understand how the government thinks about a lot of this stuff, because the government's the one that obviously sets all the policies. So their definitions and their parameters for how a lot of this stuff works is what matters the most in my view. And so from an inflationary perspective, inflation is basically a continuous increase in the price of a basket of goods. And so the Bureau of Labor Statistics will go out and they put together a basket of basically all different items that they think is reflective of like the average household's purchases. And this thing, they update it, it changes all the time. The methodologies are, I think, flawed at best, wrong at worst, so and to be fair to them, that's true of probably most inflation metrics. I mean, you're not ever, because everyone's inflation experience is different. For instance, I mean, like my inflation experience is totally different from somebody who lives in Texas or, in a foreign country, or I mean, literally everybody. So it's very hard to pin this down. And so we're talking about flawed metrics that are averages on, for the majority of the population. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics is just trying to give us, I think, an idea of where prices are in general. And so, the last few years were super, super interesting in large part because, I mean, COVID was just such a strange event. And I think I remember talking to you in 2020, talking about how inflation was likely to be higher than people expected and how the Fed was going to get caught off guard by it. And a big part of that is that the way that they measure this stuff is inherently sort of either it's rear view mirror looking, or at best they're looking out the side mirrors. They kind of see a lot of what's going on around them, but they're not in a position where they're really trying to drive this vehicle primarily by looking through the windshield, basically. And as an asset manager, I can't afford to be driving the vehicle by looking at the rear view mirror stuff. I have to be trying to understand what's coming down the pike here. And so COVID was really crazy because COVID in a lot of ways was very different from my experience with the great financial crisis, where a lot of people know me from the financial crisis as being a deflationist and basically really vocally saying that everything that's going on in the financial crisis was inherently deflationary because it was what economists would call a debt deflation, meaning that basically people bought so much debt in the pre-crisis period that when asset prices started to fall, people started to pay back all of their loans. And we can kind of get into money supply dynamics if you want to later, but basically in a really general framework, the way that the money supply in a fiat monetary system increases and decreases is that loans create money, loans create deposits. So when people are borrowing a lot, the money supply is increasing a lot. The government can also increase the financial asset supply. We can talk about that too later. But when people repay loans, that destroys money. So it's inherently this deflationary or disinflationary, meaning a falling rate of inflationary process. And so the financial crisis was inherently deflationary because you had balance sheets were all shrinking basically. And the kicker with this is that the Fed responded with a great big bazooka, and the Fed primarily operates through rescuing banks, basically. The Fed is a bank for banks. So everything they do kind of filters through the banking system. So they did a bang up job of saving all their buddies at the banks, but the problem was really at the consumer level, and consumers were suffocating from basically a balance sheet depression. And the big difference with COVID is that during the financial crisis, there was not a big fiscal policy response. So there wasn't a huge amount of government spending that came out of that. We passed like an $800 billion rescue package, if you remember. But in the grand scheme of things, it seemed big at the time, but it really wasn't that big, especially compared to COVID. And I think that was really the big lesson coming out of COVID was when I started seeing the size of these packages that were coming out, it was like, well, wait a minute, we're going to do a $2 to $3 trillion deficit this year, which means basically they're spending more than they're taxing. And that extra deficit spending in my framework is best thought of as, you can call it deficit money printing, I think, in essence, because the government is issuing super safe money-like instruments when they run a deficit. So deficits are money printing, and the size of the deficits were so big in COVID. I mean, they ended up, after we talked, they did like 2 more huge packages. So this like kept going and going by the time that by the beginning of 2022, it was like $7 trillion of deficits inside of like a 2.5-year period, which is, we're talking colossally huge numbers here. And so, the interesting thing in concordance with like quantitative easing was that, well, we did all the same stuff in 2008 with quantitative easing. The Fed ramped up their balance sheet in a huge way. Everybody called it money printing. But the difference between COVID and the GFC was that the government spent a hell of a lot more money. And so to me, that was sort of the big aha moment when I started to see the size of the government package and the composition of it. It wasn't so much, oh, the Fed is doing a lot of stuff, because the Fed did a lot of stuff back in the GFC, and inflation never really like got out of control, or it never really got high. It actually, for the next 10 years, basically continued to go down, down, down until we ended up with basically permanent zero interest rates because inflation was so low. And so, but following the GFC, following the COVID pandemic, the policies were so huge. And at the same time, the government is basically saying, stay home, don't work, don't make anything. Here's a bunch of money. So it was like the perfect recipe for, inflation 101, where the government prints a ton of money. You get supply constraints, not only because governments are telling people not to go to work, but because of all these other quirky problems with COVID. And so, you get more money chasing fewer goods, and here we are. So, that's kind of the transition of what's happened over the course of the last 2-3 years.